The story began in a workshop that smelled of oil, sawdust, and stale coffee. Outside, the world was burning. Cities vanished under firebombs. Factories thundered day and night, and every newspaper headline carried the weight of total war. But inside that small civilian workspace, one man was not building weapons, tanks, or planes. He was building toys. He was not a soldier, not a strategist, not even a scientist by military standards. He was an engineer in the most peaceful sense of the word, a man fascinated by motion, balance, and the strange poetry of how things moved when no one touched them. His tools were simple: a lathe, a few steel rods, and a restless curiosity that refused to be silenced by war. The United States in the early 1940s was a nation of production. Every machine, every worker, every hour was pointed toward one goal: victory. Civilian projects were shut down, materials were rationed, even toys were stripped from store shelves to save metal for the front. But not everyone obeyed. Some people, inventors, hobbyists, tinkerers, kept experimenting in basements and garages, as if the act of creation itself were a small rebellion against destruction. Among them was a mechanical engineer who had once designed precision springs for naval instruments. His job had been simple: to make sure compasses, rangefinders, and other delicate systems stayed stable in the violent motion of the sea. It was tedious work, mathematical and exact, but it gave him an obsession: stability in chaos. How could an object stay upright when the world tilted beneath it? In his off hours, he built small models and gadgets. He liked to watch how they moved, how they reacted to vibrations, how they returned to balance. One day, while adjusting a coiled spring on his workbench, he dropped it. It didn't just fall, it walked. The spring seemed alive, stepping gracefully from one surface to another in slow, looping motion. It wasn't a trick of the light or an illusion. It moved with a rhythm that obeyed some invisible law of physics. He watched it for a long time, then set it up again, and again. Each time, the same thing happened. The spring stabilized itself, distributed motion, absorbed energy, and converted it into controlled movement. It was mesmerizing, it was useless, and it was beautiful. The engineer's wife thought it was funny. Friends who saw it laughed, and they called it a walking spring. He smiled with them, but somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought began to form. The thing that made the spring move so gracefully was not randomness, it was equilibrium. The same principle he had spent years trying to master for instruments that had to stay level on rolling waves. At first, he didn't think of the military. He just thought about toys. The country was full of darkness and headlines about death. Children had nothing to play with. Maybe, he thought, something like this, something simple, strange, and almost hypnotic, could bring a spark of joy into a world that had forgotten how to smile. He started refining the design, adjusting the tension, experimenting with steel alloys, measuring weight against flexibility. His notebooks filled with sketches of coiled lines, annotations on momentum transfer, and calculations of oscillation periods. What he didn't realize was that he was no longer designing a toy. He was solving a problem no one had formally asked him to solve: how to maintain balance in motion. Elsewhere, in the offices of the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, another problem was consuming engineers. War at sea depended on precision. Battleships and submarines relied on gyroscopes, stabilizers, and compensators to keep their guns, periscopes, and navigation instruments steady. Yet even the most advanced technology of the time failed under strain. Heavy recoil, wave impact, and vibration constantly threw mechanical systems off balance. For every degree of instability, accuracy died. Shells missed. Torpedoes failed. Entire ships turned blind in rough seas. The Navy needed something that could absorb shock, distribute energy, and return to neutral faster than existing systems. Something simple, compact, and reliable. In his small workshop, the civilian engineer unknowingly held a crude version of that very concept in his hands. The coiled spring toy that had fascinated him was not merely a plaything. It was a perfect model of controlled kinetic transfer. Each coil distributed energy to the next, balancing tension across the structure, allowing motion without loss of orientation. It was the physical embodiment of dynamic equilibrium. He filed a patent for his spring toy in 1944, describing it as a helical spring device capable of rhythmic motion when displaced from equilibrium. No one noticed. The world was too busy with death counts and invasion plans. But somewhere deep in the machinery of wartime bureaucracy, a few Navy researchers scanning patents for mechanical innovations saw the application. The wording, "returns to equilibrium after displacement," caught their attention. At that moment, the distance between a child's toy and the Navy's most complex engineering problems vanished. The spring demonstrated a principle that could stabilize everything from torpedo guidance mechanisms to shipboard sensors. It absorbed vibration instead of resisting it, spreading motion smoothly rather than fighting it abruptly. The engineers who studied the design realized that the same mathematics could apply to mechanical dampers and gyroscopic platforms. The irony was perfect. The man who had just wanted to make something playful had, by accident, solved a fragment of a military equation that had consumed thousands of research hours. He was contacted by a representative not long after. The details remain vague. Official records only note that civilian mechanical components were evaluated for experimental applications in early 1945. But what is clear is that his idea was absorbed into a new generation of naval stabilizers and vibration dampers. The coils that once walked playfully across a workbench would soon be hidden inside machines of war, not as toys, but as principles of motion control. Before that happened, though, the engineer saw his creation through a different lens. The toy, when shown at a local exhibition, became a sensation. Children lined up to watch it walk. Adults marveled at its strange grace. It became a small commercial success, one of the few new toys to appear during the austerity of wartime America. He called it a symbol of persistence, a reminder that even when knocked off balance, things could find their rhythm again. What he didn't know was that the Navy had already started experimenting with coiled spring vibration absorbers modeled after his design. In the months that followed, prototypes began appearing in shipboard systems, reducing oscillations that had plagued earlier models. The principle was simple, but its applications were revolutionary. Instead of resisting the chaos of motion, the spring absorbed it and returned it as balance. That same logic became the foundation for more advanced gyroscopic mounts used in periscopes, rangefinders, and radar arrays. The toy effect became a weapon of precision. Back in his home, the engineer continued to refine his invention, unaware that its echo had already reached the war effort. He sold a few thousand units, packed them in plain cardboard boxes, and sent them to department stores across the country. The toy became a small national curiosity, a distraction from the newsreels of bombings and battles. To the public, it was nothing more than a clever gimmick. To the Navy, it was inspiration. In hindsight, the convergence seems inevitable. Many wartime innovations came not from military laboratories, but from the minds of civilians who thought differently, people who were not bound by doctrine or bureaucracy. They saw motion, balance, and failure through simpler eyes. What the military saw as instability, they saw as rhythm. The engineer's spring, which he had named for the way it slinked down steps, would become famous after the war as a toy. But its quiet influence ran deeper. In technical journals from the late 1940s, references began appearing to coil-based dampers and distributed motion stabilizers, systems directly modeled on the same mechanical behavior. The Navy's interest was never advertised. It didn't need to be. The results spoke for themselves: smoother targeting, fewer system failures, and instruments that held steady under conditions that once crippled them. The idea that something so innocent could hide a military advantage was not new, but in this case, it was poetic. A device built for amusement had embodied one of the most elegant truths of engineering, that stability isn't achieved by resisting motion, but by mastering it. For the man who created it, the connection to the Navy came as a surprise years later. He never sought recognition for its military use. To him, it remained what it always had been: a beautiful accident proof that curiosity could survive even in times of destruction. But for the engineers who studied it, it became an enduring lesson that sometimes the solution to the hardest problems lies not in aggression or control, but in understanding how to move with the chaos instead of against it. The toy that shouldn't have mattered did. It bridged two worlds, one of innocence and one of war. And in doing so, it quietly proved that creativity is a weapon far older and far more powerful than steel. When the first shipment of the new walking spring toys left the factory, it was barely noticed. Wartime America had little time for novelty, but deep inside a research division of the U.S. Navy, the toy's patent had been flagged. The description, short and technical, spoke of energy transfer, oscillation, and a system that returns naturally to equilibrium after displacement. For the right kind of reader, those words carried the weight of potential. The Navy's problem was old and unsolved. Ships were floating weapons platforms, but they lived at the mercy of the sea. Every wave, every vibration, every gun recoil threw their instruments off by fractions of a degree, enough to miss a target, to lose a bearing, to fail a shot. Gyroscopic stabilizers existed, but they were heavy, fragile, and expensive. The system that kept a compass steady could not keep a cannon sighted, and the ocean did not wait for engineers to catch up. What the patent described, a helical spring that distributed force gradually instead of resisting it instantly, was a language the Navy understood but rarely saw in civilian hands. The idea that oscillation could be harnessed instead of suppressed challenged conventional design logic. Yet the small demonstration photographs attached to the patent showed something uncanny: balance through motion. The Bureau of Ships quietly ordered several units for mechanical behavior evaluation. No one called them toys. They were spring-based mechanical dampers, helical in design. They arrived in plain crates with no branding, no colorful packaging, only serial numbers. In laboratories near Philadelphia and Annapolis, engineers placed them on test rigs meant to simulate vibration under rolling sea conditions. The results were immediate. Instead of shuddering apart or transmitting shock through rigid mounts, the coiled springs absorbed motion, spread it evenly, and returned to rest faster than comparable systems. The effect was simple and measurable: less resonance, less vibration, faster recovery. For a machine gun mount, that meant a steadier aim. For a radar platform, it meant fewer calibration errors. For a submarine's internal instruments, it meant survival. The principle, equilibrium through flexibility, was not new in theory, but it had rarely been captured in such pure form. Military engineers had spent years trying to isolate motion. This device redirected it. It embodied a paradox that only a civilian, unburdened by military procedure, could have seen clearly. The best way to find balance was to let movement flow, not to fight it. The Navy commissioned a study through the Naval Research Laboratory to analyze energy dissipation properties of coiled helical stabilizers. The report, now mostly forgotten in archives, marked the first step toward applying the toy's physics to serious machinery. Prototypes of new vibration dampers were produced in limited quantities, small cylindrical mounts using layered steel coils. These were installed on shipboard gyroscopic stabilizers, periscope mounts, and later, experimental radar assemblies. Testing was brutal. Machines were exposed to constant mechanical stress, simulating storm conditions, artillery shock, and engine vibration. The coiled dampers outperformed every rigid suspension system. They allowed the delicate components to float within their housings, absorbing kinetic energy rather than transmitting it. The engineers noted that recovery time, the interval between impact and stability, dropped by nearly 40. For the Navy, that meant precision. For the war, it meant a margin of advantage invisible to the public, but critical in combat. The technology was classified not because it was large or dangerous, but because it was simple. Simplicity was often the most powerful secret. A discovery too easy to copy could not be risked in the open. So the innovation, born from a civilian's curiosity, disappeared into the black budgets and coded reports of wartime research. In the following months, adaptation moved fast. Factories that once produced mechanical parts for civilian equipment began manufacturing refined versions of the coil stabilizers. The design was modified, reinforced, standardized. Naval drawings from 1945 show compact cylindrical dampers labeled Type S dynamic balancer, noted as helical compensating units. No mention of the original inventor appears. While engineers in white coats tested the devices under fluorescent lights, ships at sea began receiving quiet upgrades. Newly outfitted gun mounts recoiled smoother. Radar arrays remained calibrated longer. Precision optics no longer drifted as wildly in rough water. In the Pacific, reports from destroyer crews mentioned improved stability of sighting gear during heavy seas. No one on those decks knew that the mechanism responsible had once been a toy. For the civilians who built the components in anonymous factories, it was just another wartime contract. Steel coils, machined to specification, packed in crates, shipped under sealed manifests. They were told nothing of where the parts went or what they did. But somewhere between assembly lines and shipyards, the boundary between innocence and war blurred again. The Navy understood the irony. In a time when entire research divisions were chasing atomic power, jet propulsion, and radar, one of its most effective mechanical improvements had come from a toy shop. It was a quiet reminder that not all revolutions came from laboratories. Some came from a man with a spring and a question. In internal correspondence, the head of the materials research branch called it the most efficient energy redistribution mechanism per unit weight yet tested. The tone was dry, bureaucratic, but the meaning was extraordinary. The coiled damper had become a fundamental element of vibration control, the kind of invisible invention that changes everything without anyone noticing. It was soon incorporated into stabilizing platforms across multiple systems. In torpedoes, it reduced oscillation in guidance fins. In radar masts, it isolated the antenna from hull vibrations. Even in aircraft carrier elevators, it softened the motion of landing deck mechanisms. Its presence was everywhere and nowhere, hidden beneath layers of machinery, performing the same quiet task it had in the inventor's hands, restoring balance. As the war entered its final year, these refinements became part of the Navy's broader modernization effort. Precision meant survival. In the chaos of the Pacific, where a misaligned periscope could doom a submarine and a shaking compass could send a convoy off course, any gain in stability was worth a fortune. The new coil-based dampers became standard equipment in several ship classes by late 1945. No ceremony marked their arrival. There were no headlines or press releases. They simply appeared, quietly, efficiently, like a trick of physics made real. For the civilian inventor, the war's end came and went without recognition. His spring toy had become a national curiosity, its commercial success modest but steady. He never knew the full extent of its military shadow. The U.S. Navy, bound by secrecy, never acknowledged the connection publicly. To the world, his creation remained a plaything. Inside the archives, though, the paper trail told another story. Technical memos described civilian-origin helical devices adapted for defense applications. Reports cross-referenced his patent. Test notes praised their performance. But after the war, when declassification swept through many programs, this one stayed buried. Too small to matter, too useful to forget. In peacetime, the same principle that stabilized weapons was reborn in industry. Vibration isolators based on coil distribution appeared in aviation, architecture, and machinery. The war had transformed a toy into a universal engineering solution. Civilian industries copied the Navy's refinements, unaware that the process had come full circle, from a civilian to the military and back again. The transformation was symbolic of an era. Total war blurred the lines between soldier and citizen, invention and necessity. Civilians supplied ideas the military could never have imagined, precisely because they weren't looking for war in them. They were looking for beauty, simplicity, and order. That perspective gave rise to one of the most effective hidden technologies of the conflict. The physics of play had become the mechanics of precision. The idea echoed long after the war. In the early 1950s, when the Navy developed advanced inertial navigation systems for submarines, engineers still cited the same equations used to describe the spring's motion: damping coefficients, oscillatory transfer, return to equilibrium. The terminology persisted. The principle endured. The device that had once rolled off a workbench had reshaped an entire field of engineering. The line between game and guidance, between curiosity and control, had dissolved. For the Navy, the lesson was strategic. Never underestimate the civilian mind. For every monumental breakthrough funded by the state, there were smaller, quieter ones, born from kitchens, garages, and workshops that solved problems no laboratory could. The man behind the spring never became famous in the way inventors dream of. His toy lived on in department stores, in the hands of children, a coiled curiosity that walked endlessly across tables and stairs. Few knew that deep within its graceful descent was the same principle that once steadied the guns and instruments of a warship. In its playful rhythm lay a blueprint for control, a metaphor for survival. To move forward by falling, to balance by bending, to return to equilibrium through motion. When the Navy had first tested the device, the lead engineer wrote one sentence in his report: "Equilibrium is achieved not by resisting the wave, but by flowing with it." That was as close as any military document ever came to poetry. The rest was mathematics, efficiency charts, vibration graphs, proof that the impossible had been noticed, understood, and quietly absorbed into the machinery of war. No medals, no parades, no signatures. Just a single idea, born from play, that found its way to the heart of the world's most powerful navy and stayed there, invisible, for decades. When the war ended, the machine of secrecy began to slow. Laboratories went quiet. The classified reports were sealed, boxed, and stored under fluorescent light. The world outside moved on. Ships returned to ports, and engineers went home to quiet lives. But the technology they had built, the small spring-based stabilizers, the dampers, the balance mechanisms, remained hidden in the hulls of vessels that had survived the ocean's violence. They were proof that even the smallest ideas could carry the weight of an empire. In the months after victory, the United States Navy began its long process of demobilization. Research contracts were canceled, laboratories dismantled, and projects reclassified or destroyed. Yet the coil principle endured. It was too simple, too effective, too elegant to discard. The mechanical systems that had relied on it continued to serve, unacknowledged but indispensable. In factories, the same technology appeared again, stripped of its secrecy. Engineers who had worked on vibration control during the war transferred their knowledge to civilian industries. Aircraft manufacturers used coil-based dampers in cockpit instruments. Automobile engineers adopted similar designs to stabilize engines and suspensions. Even skyscraper architects borrowed the principle for wind compensation systems. The movement of energy through motion, the core idea that had come from a spring walking across a table, had become a universal language of engineering. The physics of play had evolved into a science of stability. For the man who had invented it, life was far simpler. He never knew the full extent of what his idea had done. He was a civilian, a designer of toys, not a student of military history. His creation, now known worldwide as the Slinky, became one of the most popular toys of the century. Millions were sold in the first decade after the war. Its coiled body, once mistaken for a curiosity, became an icon of post-war optimism, a simple joy in a world trying to forget what it had endured. He saw children laughing, parents smiling, advertisements promising happiness for less than $1. The country embraced the toy as a symbol of movement and renewal. It was cheap, harmless, and strangely hypnotic. No one mentioned that the same behavior that made it dance down a staircase had once stabilized radar platforms and torpedoes. The story stayed buried in research archives and technical manuals, but the influence never disappeared. It continued to evolve, spreading quietly through the disciplines of engineering and physics. The concept of distributed motion balance, the controlled transfer of energy through flexible, repeating structures, became foundational in fields ranging from aerospace design to robotics. Every system that needed to remain stable under stress borrowed a fragment of the spring's lesson. Balance comes not from rigidity, but from controlled flexibility. By the 1950s, the idea had entered the new frontier of the Cold War. In laboratories developing guided missiles and satellites, engineers used coiled dampers and flexible stabilizers to isolate sensitive components from vibration. The mechanical descendant of a toy sat at the heart of machines built to navigate space and carry warheads across oceans. It was the same paradox repeated. Play turned into power, curiosity transformed into control. The inventor never patented the military adaptations of his idea. He had no reason to. The Navy never revealed the connection, and in truth, no single engineer could claim ownership of a principle that had become universal. He remained the maker of a toy, the man who turned a spring into something graceful. His creation became a household object, and his name faded behind its brand. He died decades later, without ever realizing that his playful experiment had shaped the foundation of modern mechanical design. For the world, his legacy was innocent. For history, it was quietly profound. The broader story, hidden in the margins of wartime engineering, tells something deeper about how nations fight and how they learn. Total war had forced humanity to mobilize not only armies, but imagination. Every citizen, every idea, every odd curiosity had the potential to alter the balance. The boundary between civilian and soldier dissolved. Creativity itself became a weapon. The spring was not alone. Civilians invented radar components, code machines, and camouflage systems. Housewives devised packing materials that protected ammunition. Teenagers collected scrap metal that became aircraft parts. But the spring stood apart because it embodied the paradox completely. It was designed to amuse, not to kill. And yet, by embodying the physics of balance, it gave the war machine one of its most precise tools. That irony is what makes it unforgettable. In post-war technical literature, engineers began using a term that captured its essence: resonant damping. It meant using rhythm to cancel rhythm, motion to control motion. It was the same phenomenon that made the toy sway gently until it found stillness. When the first spacecraft were built in the late 1950s, their instrument housings used the same principle to survive launch vibrations. The toy effect, though never credited, had entered the space age. Meanwhile, in living rooms across America, children sent their slinkies down staircases, watching them tumble, recover, and continue. A perfect metaphor for the century itself. The world had fallen, recovered, and learned to keep moving. The inventor's original notebooks filled with hand-drawn coils and notes about equilibrium through motion were preserved long after his death. Engineers who later examined them recognized that his sketches were, in essence, simplified diagrams of energy distribution systems. What he had intuited by accident had taken physicists decades to formalize in equations. The line between instinct and science had vanished. In time, even the Navy's classified files surfaced. When portions of wartime research were declassified in the late 1980s, historians found references to civilian-origin helical dampers in multiple programs. The descriptions matched the toy's mechanical behavior exactly. The discovery was greeted not with scandal, but with quiet admiration. The idea that a toy could shape a Navy's precision systems was no longer absurd. It was poetic. Today, that same principle exists in countless machines that define modern life. The suspension systems in trains and vehicles, the mounts that hold cameras steady, the isolation systems that protect skyscrapers from earthquakes, all rely on controlled motion, not rigid resistance. Every time a bridge sways safely in the wind or a jet engine remains stable at high speed, it echoes the same discovery made in that small wartime workshop. The spring that once walked across a desk had taught engineers to respect motion rather than fear it. It had turned instability into a tool. That lesson outlasted its inventor, outlasted the war, and outlasted the secrecy that hid it. It became a quiet truth of human progress, that the line between destruction and creation depends only on the hand that holds the idea. In every war, Countless inventions are born to kill, but sometimes one is born to endure. The story of the spring stands as proof that curiosity can outlive conflict. What began as a harmless distraction in a time of darkness became a bridge between play and precision, innocence and power. Its transformation mirrored the transformation of the era itself, from chaos toward balance, from fear toward understanding. The Navy, like the rest of the world, moved on to new technologies: electronics, computers, automation. The mechanical dampers disappeared into history, replaced by digital systems and silent processors. But the principle remained. The machines grew smarter, faster, more complex. Yet at their core, they still obeyed the same ancient truth the toy had revealed. Stability is never still. Every gyroscope, every drone, every spacecraft carries that legacy, the understanding that movement, when controlled, creates order. It is difficult to say whether the man who built the first walking spring would have wanted his creation used for war. Probably not. But history rarely asks for permission. It simply absorbs what it needs. In the end, his invention did not belong to the battlefield. It belonged to the human instinct to find balance amid chaos, whether in a child's laughter or in the machinery of a ship. And perhaps that is why it mattered so much. It reminded a world consumed by conflict that stability could come from curiosity, not control. That invention was not just a tool of survival, but a reflection of what humanity could be when it created for wonder rather than fear. The spring kept moving, step by step, long after the guns fell silent. And in its endless rhythm, rise, fall, recover, the story of an age continued to unfold.